Thank you, Rich. Good afternoon, everybody. For those out on the West Coast, I guess it's still good morning. For us on the East Coast, it's getting into the afternoon. So excited to get to jump in and talk about not necessarily a new topic, but kind of some rebranding that Citrix has gone through with the NetScaler platform. So a lot of you guys have probably worked with the NetScaler. You're probably rolling out NetScalers. If you're not familiar with it, Citrix has gone in and decided to kind of change the formalized version of that name. And so they announced a lot of changes recently to their product naming. And this has always been the ADC. We just never really called it that. So you would sign up for a NetScaler class, and if I wanted to show you the product page, I would take you to citrix.com/NetScaler, and it would take you to the page for the NetScaler ADC. And now they want to go in and focus more on it's less about being a NetScaler and more about being what they're calling an application delivery controller. And that is really the space that the NetScaler has been in for the past several generations. We don't really have big products out there that are just load balancers. So nobody is just doing load balancing. They're doing load balancing as a part of all sorts of stuff. And so ADC, or Application Delivery Controller, is a term that defines that niche market. It defines the feature set. And so Citrix has really jumped in and kind of stepped that up and said, hey, we want this product to now be called the Citrix ADC. Okay? So kind of exciting to get to go in and talk about some of that. But if you're not familiar with the NetScaler and the ADC, we've kind of put this webinar together to go in and talk about some of the things that have really changed, and in my opinion, some of the things that have really improved over the past couple of years. And so a lot of times we do get in this mindset of this thing does load balancing. This thing does remote access. And we kind of lose sight of some of the small little changes that come about with that. So I wanted to go in and talk about a couple things. First of all, kind of a refresh of the platforms. They have added a new one into that recently. So some of you guys are probably familiar with MPXs and VPXs. The SDX has been around for probably about 6 or 7 years. And then more recently, they've come up with the CPX. So I want to talk about what's similar and what's different. And then another big change that's come out within the last year and a half has been a transition from 32-bit operating systems to 64-bit. A lot of people are not necessarily familiar with that. So we'll go in and kind of talk about that and what that is bringing to the table. There's also some exciting things going on with SSL. And so we'll talk a little bit about the technological stuff, and probably this first part is going to be a little bit theory. Maybe we'll even diagram up a couple things. And then one of the things I love most is getting hands-on with it. And so there's about 4 hours worth of demo in the bottom 3 bullet points there. And thanks to some major changes with the NetScaler and the ADC and some of the technology, we can cram that into a webinar and show you a lot of really neat stuff that they've come out with that simplifies some of the deployment, some of the optimization. We'll talk about SSL, and one of the big headaches with that is moving users that don't know how to spell HTTPS. How do we get them redirected? We'll talk about the traditional way as well as some modern ways, as well as some new things that they've slipped in there. We'll also talk about the Unified Gateway. That's what they've been calling it. You've had the Unified Gateway, you've had the NetScaler Gateway, and now it's going to be called the Citrix Gateway. And I want to go in and really show you how we would roll out a gateway and actually get it setting up doing XenApp and XenDesktop for us very easily. And so there's some neat things that they've brought about with that. And then as a part of using that, I want to talk a little bit about RDP Proxy. I've seen some people go in and use this outside of the Citrix environment. And then what Citrix is doing is going in and kind of consolidating some of the remote access. So why have a separate solution for this and that and then a third one? You could consolidate it all in. And so I'll show you kind of what that looks like and what that brings to the table. So all sorts of exciting stuff to go in and talk about over the next 30 minutes. So first of all, ADC platforms, okay? And what we've got is we've got the hardware platform. And what this hardware platform is this is where you go in and buy into a tier of equipment from Citrix. So if you pull up the data sheet for this, it's going to tell you you're buying physical hardware. It's got a defined size, 1U, 2Us, whatever, memory, CPU, power supplies, redundant power supplies, all that good stuff. And then probably port configurations as well. So does it have some 1 gig ports? Does it have so many 10 gig ports, 40, 50, whatever? And so you've got a series. Some of you guys might have like the 11500 series, or you might have the 14,000 series, or there's a 22,000 series. And so that's defining hardware. And then inside of that, they've got specific specs for what that hardware can do. So with the 14,000 series, you can buy the 14,020. So that's 14020. And what it does is it's a defined set of hardware that's common to all 14,000 series products, but that 20 at the end tells you that product pushes 20 gigs of throughput. Separately, they've got the 40 in there. So you've got a 40 gig, you've got 60, 80, all the way up to 100 gigs. And so you can go in and buy a physical piece of hardware and be able to scale that as you need to. Got it? Now, with the MPX, what that means is that piece of hardware is going to do one configuration. So you're going to assign an IP address, it boots up, it loads BSD, you connect to your NetScaler, and you say, this is what I want it to do. And then you've got one NetScaler, one config, if we need to, we say one ns.conf file for what's happening on there. And then it's going to be able to push up to whatever those rated specs are that you've purchased. Okay? The SDX is going to be a big enhancement to that. And so what's going to happen is it's the exact same piece of hardware. But instead of booting up into BSD and loading the NetScaler, it's going to load a hypervisor. And so it's got an optimized hypervisor that's going to allow you to create multiple instances of NetScalers on top of it. Okay? And so what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to go in and create multiple NetScalers, and then each of those NetScalers is going to be completely unique. So you could assign it unique resources, so different memory and CPU, different interfaces. You can go in and specify what level of throughput it's going to get. So what level of throughput, how many transactions per second. And so out of your overall aggregate, you can go in and carve it up into multiple instances. They can be completely independent as far as firmware goes. Okay? And then you've got lifecycle independence. So if one of your instances reboots, doesn't affect anything else. And so you can go in and create, depending on the platform, up to 80 of these instances on an SDX platform. And then you can share out whatever that rated bandwidth is that you've purchased. Okay? So a lot of neat stuff that we can do with that. In the past, you might have situations where people needed a NetScaler in their DMZ, and then they needed an internal NetScaler. So we used to buy multiple MPXs. Now we can buy one SDX and host instances, one for the DMZ, one for internal, right on that consolidated platform. So a lot of neat things that we can go in and do with that. Now, this is separate from the virtual appliance, and what you've got is the VPX. And what the VPX does is this is a virtual machine that runs on top of your own hardware and your own hypervisor. So it's not something you've purchased from Citrix. It's something that you've gone in and actually you're already invested in with your hardware platform. So Dell servers or HP or whatever. You've got your hypervisor of choice, Hyper-V or Zen server or ESX. And then what you're going to do is you're going to purchase a virtual appliance to put on top of your hardware and hypervisor, and then go in and license it. And so what they let you do is they go in and let you license the throughput numbers that you need. And so traditionally we had a couple of different variants. So there's been a 10 megabit VPX. There's been a 200 megabit. There's a gigabit and a 3 gigabit. And then more recently, they've kind of done things a little bit different. What we used to have was the control domain of your hypervisor was really your bottleneck. So if your hypervisor can't push more than 3 gigs of throughput to a VM, Citrix probably shouldn't sell you more than 3 gigs of NetScaler capability. Now they can use what's called SRIOV, and they can pass through an interface to the VM. So if you've got a 10 gig interface, you've got a VM that can push 10 gigs. Got it? And so with that, we've now got room for additional capabilities. So on the VPX product line, a big change over the past couple years has been they've added additional SKUs to this. So you can get a 5 gig, a 10 gig, 20 gig, 40 gig, and even up to 100 gig VPX. So a little bit cheaper because you're not buying your hardware from Citrix, but you're getting all of that capability. You're getting that put into this virtual appliance, and then you can go and deploy this and take advantage of the virtual infrastructure instead of having to invest in a hardware platform. Okay? Now, speaking of versatility, another major change that they've made is what they're calling pooled bandwidth. And so traditionally when you buy, and then the numbers I threw out were like a 1 gig NetScaler. So maybe you buy a 1 gig VPX. Okay? It does 1 gig. And it's tied to a MAC address, and so you've got a little bit of a relationship there between your VPX and the hardware it runs on. And what happens is people are expanding out their data centers, or they're moving to the cloud. Okay? That is a big thing that we're seeing. Well, what happens to that investment in your NetScaler? Well, if you've got an on-prem piece of hardware, it's kind of hard to move that to the cloud. Well, with pooled bandwidth, you can go in and buy the bandwidth that meets your needs, and then you can allocate that, and you can check that in and out wherever you need to. So if you need 100 gigs of bandwidth, you can buy 100 gigs of bandwidth and then put it all in your data center today. And then in 6 months, when you start migrating to the cloud, you can reallocate that and say, okay, let's do 20 gigs to the cloud. Let's do the remaining 80 on site. Or let's do 20 to the cloud and 20 to our branch office, and then that leaves 60 on site. And so you can now go in and reprovision your VPX bandwidth basically on demand. So a big change from what we've seen in the past, and it really goes in and makes this product line even more flexible. Okay? Now, I want to talk about the bottom bullet point down there. This is the newest member to the family. This is called the CPX. The C is usually what we would call containerized. Okay? And what this is a different flavor of the NetScaler. Okay? And it is a little bit of a hybrid model here, or it's the outcast, however you want to go and look at it. And what happens is NetScaler admins have big mouths. Okay? What we do is we get our NetScalers, we get them all set up, we go in, we're doing awesome stuff, and then we like to brag. Okay? Anytime you do something good, you want to talk about it. So you go in and start talking about what you're able to do with content switching. We start talking about what we can do with rewrite and responder, and how we're able to go in and do all sorts of cool optimizations using NetScaler technology. Well, what happens is the application guys pick up on that, and they say, man, I wish I had that functionality when I was developing my apps. Well, guess what? The Citrix response to that is the CPX. And so this is a NetScaler, not necessarily to replace your core NetScaler. Okay? Instead, it is going to be a component that's really going to supplement the DevOps lifecycle. So as they're going in and developing an application, they can go in and spin up a CPX in a Linux Docker. And so you just stand up a Linux machine, you go in and you add this Docker to it, and then what it does is it gives you the standard edition features of the NetScaler. Load balancing, content switching, rewrite, responder, a lot of the core functionality that we need. Okay? Unlike traditional standard editions, it does not give you the gateway. Okay? And a little bit tricky here, it doesn't give you a GUI. Okay? But the idea is that if this is being used by application developers, they're writing code anyway, so they should be able to dig in and go in and use this. They've also got some other tools out there, really leaning on the MAS appliance, and that goes in and kind of helps you with some of this deployment. So what they've done is they've simplified out all the networking and said, let's have traffic come in, let's have traffic leave, and then let you go in and optimize it. And so for a lot of NetScaler admins, it gets them out of the business of having to maintain and develop how to optimize the application, puts that in the hands of the application developers, and then bringing CPX in along with one of the other traditional NetScalers, goes in and gives you your infrastructure, and then behind that infrastructure, very optimized, very lean NetScaler functionalities. And so CPX is kind of new to the environment. They've gone in and brought that in. And then there's some people that are able to go in and use that. And so instead of having to turn an app developer into a full-fledged NetScaler admin, or take a NetScaler admin who's got a networking in route switch or security or something like that, and turn them into an application guy, CPX becomes a really valuable tool to go and kind of bridge that gap, show them a little bit of that functionality, and let the guys that do the app development really go in and kind of hone our NetScaler capabilities for their applications. And so some neat stuff that is coming about because of that technology. Okay. Also, guys, if you're not familiar with it, as we start moving into 12.1, we start calling this the ADC instead of the NetScaler. I use those interchangeably. Okay. Something else to watch out for is they are going to be throwing out a couple of different additions with this. And so we've always had Standard, Enterprise, and Platinum. As you get into the 12.1 version, watch out. The functionalities, the feature sets are going to be pretty much identical, but Standard is still going to be called Standard. What we've called Enterprise, they are going to go in and start calling the Advanced Edition. Okay? And then separately, you've got what we've always called Platinum. They're going to go in and start calling that Premium. And so you will see a little bit of a difference in some of the packaging when you actually get to the 12.1 ADC versus what we've seen in traditional NetScaler versions. Yeah. Also, something else to talk about. This goes back to the 12.0 version. Okay. And in the 12.0 version, they introduced a 64-bit version of the code. Now, if they had not introduced a 64-bit version of the code, I probably would not have known that we were using 32-bit operating systems. I would have probably assumed, like a lot of people, when we made the transition from single-core NetScalers to multi-core NetScalers, that we obviously would have gone from 32-bit to 64-bit. And that assumption would have been wrong. We've been using 32-bit all along the way. So all of our in-core 9.2, 9.3, 10.0, 10.1, 10.5, 11.0, and even 11.1, all of those were 32-bit. And so when they come out with the 12.0 version of the code, you can reach out to Citrix support and you can get a 64-bit version of it. And then in the 12.1 version, obviously you've got 32 and 64. They just make that a little bit more readily available and ready for prime time. Now, what does it matter? Okay? And I'll just go in and tell you that flat out, most of the time, it doesn't. Okay? This is not going to go in and give us some great capabilities for our load balancing. It's not going to go in and change anything as far as our policy-driven functionality. Okay? So being 32-bit versus 64-bit isn't going to go in and give us a major performance increase. We're already on good quality hardware. We're already on lean code. So there's not a lot to be garnered from that. Okay? What this change is about RAM. Okay? And what happens is with a 32-bit OS, we are limited in terms of how much RAM we can address. And so as you've got certain features on the NetScaler that are driven by RAM, we do run into some problems where that can go in and be a little bit of a constraint. And so jumping over to the 64-bit version does go in and give us some big improvements there. Okay? And so if we're talking about integrated caching, storing objects on the NetScaler, that needs RAM. And so having access to more RAM can go in and actually increase the viability of that function. Same thing with admin partitions. That goes in and really increases the need for RAM, and we can go in and kind of build on that as well. So a couple of things that are RAM constrained, now they're not going to be. Okay. Now, another big driver in some of the new versions. So you've got NetScaler 12. One of the big things they start talking about is SSL improvements. Okay. And so they're going in and doing some different things with the elliptical curve or the hybrid SSL, and it's increasing the number of transactions per second that we can perform. And so you've actually got 3 times or 300% improvement. And I've tested this out, and yeah, I've actually seen around that number. And so we can actually get, by switching from 11.1 to 12.0, much better performance. Okay? This is really valuable for VPX. Okay? If you're buying a hardware NetScaler, it's got a Cavium SSL offload card, and it's done a decent job of performing SSL, encryption and decryption. The VPX has leaned on the CPU, And that's been some of the bottleneck for that. Now, with these improvements in the processing, you're getting a lot more SSL transactions per second. Okay. You'll also see on here, when you get to 12.0 build 59, they've gone in and included the more secure TLS ciphers in their cipher group. So when we're rolling that out, by default, we're a little bit more secure. Also, DTLS, you guys are not familiar with it. Zen App, Zen Desktop. We've now got a protocol called Enlightened Data Transport. So kind of the next evolution of ICA and HDX is going to be EDT. And so in your 12.0 builds, you've got support for securing that across the internet. So they call that DTLS, Datagram Transport Layer Security. We go in and get that in here as well. Also, when we move to 12.1, okay, Citrix jumps in and throws in support for TLS version 1.3. Okay? So not necessarily something that everybody is using. We haven't seen this in the past, but it is now a protocol that is available to us with the 12.1 NetScaler. Also, major change. They've gone in and really kind of removed some of the unsafe ciphers that we've had in the back end. And so sometimes people say, well, why are they not going in and updating this? The NetScaler is a very additive product. And so what was a good idea at a certain point in time kind of sticks with that over time. And then eventually we have to come in and kind of correct for that. And they've done that in 12.1. And so in 12.1, they've gone in and said, hey, here's some things that are unsafe. We need to go in and remove this. So now that default profile type is going to go in and have your secured ciphers. It removes some of the broken ciphers. And so this should get us an A+ on our SSL score by default. This is something that if you guys are familiar with this, you can go in and have your site tested. Do you meet the A+, and are you doing what you're supposed to do? And oftentimes, out of the box, we're not. And so you've got to go in and follow some of the guides out there to whittle down what we're doing, refine it, hone it in, and make it a little bit more secure to get us up there to the A+ rating. Guess what? Now we can roll out 12.1, and we can get that by default. So a big improvement that they've thrown in here to help us out with that. Okay. Now, speaking of SSL, I want to go in and talk a little bit about some of the SSL functionality on the NetScaler and a couple of different things. For instance, HTTP to SSL redirects. This is kind of a fun one, and we have fun with this in class, and we pick on certain people that are using this. But in reality, there's a nice down and dirty, easy way to do an HTTP to SSL redirect. And it is to go in and create a down virtual server. And so what you do is you create a down virtual server, and when a user comes in, it uses the protection feature of the NetScaler to say, hey, you need to be redirected somewhere else. And then we use that to move you from HTTP to SSL. Okay. And so there are wizards on the NetScaler that do that. Down and dirty, it works. Okay. As a best practice, okay, or if we're using the NetScaler Gateway, there is a little bit of a better way to do this. And what happens is we can go in and create a service that's permanently up and tie that to a virtual server that's permanently up. So we get rid of the whole down virtual server concept. And then we use Responder, which is a much more efficient feature to go in and redirect users from HTTP to SSL. Let me show you what this looks like. Okay. So here is my lab environment. And what I've got is I've got some load balancing going on. And so I've got some different things in here. So for instance, I've got Storefront. And so you guys should know that if you want to go in and interact with Storefront, you need to be coming in using SSL. And so what happens is, if I don't, okay, so if I come in here using the wrong protocol, whoops, then I'm hitting my NetScaler, and my NetScaler doesn't know what to do with that. And so what we've traditionally done to fix this is we created a down virtual server. We'd give it a name like this to go in and say, this is doing a redirect. And so you would put this in place and then not bind it to anything. And then you use a protection feature over here to move to HTTPS. Yep. Now, a lot of you guys are going to say, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. And so what you've got is you've got a down virtual server, and that will move you from the HTTP protocol to SSL. Got? You need to see it play out. If I come in here and say, give me content, now it goes in and redirects me. Got? So as far as the client's concerned, does it work? Yes. Is this the best practice? Technically, no. Okay? Because you're using a down virtual server, so this will generate SNMP alerts and let you know that it's down. Also, it's very inefficient from a packet processing standpoint. Okay? A little bit more efficient way would be able to go in and use responder. And so what you can do is create a responder action for HTTP to SSL. And then you go in and set it up to do a redirect. And you say, let's redirect to HTTPS. Yep. And then you say, let's add in the requested URL. And then append to that. Whoops. Sorry, guys. And then we say append to that the path and query. And so this will go after the host name. This will go after the path and query. So whatever it is you put into the address bar, send you to the SSL version of it. And so we can go in and create an action to do that. We create a responder policy. Oops. To do the redirect. And then we jump in here and say, let's redirect. Yep. And then it says when, and then you could go in and say always. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and do a little bit of reverse logic. This says the client's coming in using SSL. Yep. And if I throw an exclamation point out here, it negates it to say the client is not using SSL. And so I've got a responder policy in action to handle my redirects. And so I can very simply come in here and bind this to this virtual server. And so now this guy is going to get redirected because of responder, not because of the protection feature. And then if I want this guy to actually be up and available, what I do is I go in and create a fake service. Okay? So I just create a fake service. I can tie it to, whatever I want on the back end. Okay? Just making something up. It goes to test that IP address. And what I do is I go in and disable the monitoring. And now this is a service that will never go down. And then when I bind it to a virtual server, that virtual server will never go down. And so now I've got a virtual server up and available, always ready to go in and redirect users. So now anytime a user comes in to the HTTP version, like this, then my responder policy is going to kick in and go in and redirect them. Okay? Guys, if we're doing the NetScaler Gateway, we need to go in and do that. Okay? Traditionally, if you're using some of the older versions of the NetScaler and you need to go in and do a redirect, this would go in and accomplish it. Okay? Good news, though. We don't actually need to do this anymore. Okay? We will need to do it for the gateway, but if we're just talking about load balancing, this is where I want you to go. I want you to go to the storefront load balancer. Guess what? I don't need to create a virtual server at all. Okay? Just to show you I've got nothing up my sleeve. If I come in and try to connect using HTTP again, my NetScaler says I have no idea what you're asking for. Okay? What they've done in the 11.1 version of the code and newer, you can come in here. This is your SSL virtual server. This is what you want users to connect to. They've added an ability to go in and redirect automatically. Okay? And so what we can do is we can come in here and say we need to redirect users that are coming in on port 80. And so now the NetScaler is going to start listening on port 80. I don't have to have a virtual server on port 80. And if that's what they're doing, I can redirect them. You just plug this in like this. And so now my virtual server is ready to go in and redirect users from HTTP to SSL. Okay? So come back here, user comes in, and now my NetScaler is automatically listening for that. Now, this is the IIS start page. Technically, there's a whole URL and everything for this. Okay? But you get the general idea. If I come in on the wrong protocol, this will go in and actually redirect me. And so they slipped that in there in the 11.1 version. Really neat, really helpful. Cuts down on a lot of the configuration that we had to manually put in place to go in and make this work. Yeah. Now, jumping back kind of to my PowerPoint over here. Okay. I want to talk about the Citrix Gateway, specifically the wizard. Now, they added this wizard in, and they called it a little bit of a different feature. It was called the Unified Gateway. So if you've got NetScaler 11.0 or 11.1 or even 12.0, you've got the Unified Gateway. Okay? And probably one of the best parts of this is that you've got what's called the Unified Gateway Wizard. And what this wizard does is it goes in and makes it easy to roll out a gateway. Okay? If you're not familiar with what the gateway is, technically it goes in and provides you full SSL VPN. It provides you the clientless access. It provides you ICA Proxy. Okay? And so what happens is we can go in and use this for all sorts of remote access functionality. Okay? Like I said, we got about 4 hours worth of demos. So going in and rolling this out sometimes would take me probably about 1 to 2 hours, if not more. Okay? A lot of moving pieces to this, a lot that goes into getting this set up. Good news is we've simplified this down so I could very easily jump into the lab here and show you what it looks like to roll out the Unified Gateway. So down here, you've got the NetScaler Gateway. So for those of you guys that are traditionalists, you're trying to roll out a NetScaler Gateway virtual server to go in and handle your remote access. Okay? Using the wizard down here, you click on Unified Gateway. And it says, let's get an IP address, let's get a certificate, let's do authentication, and let's provide access to resources. And they make this very easy to run through a wizard-based GUI to set this up. And what it's going to do is it's going to go in and create some powerful stuff to be able to go in and allow us to remote access to various things. Okay? So it does this. It wants us to go in and give this thing a name. Okay? I always use like UGW and then Gateway. That's going to be my FQD in here. And then my IP address, I plug in. And then that's going to be the IP address that goes with gateway.training.lab, so I can do the demos. So you'll see the 5-step wizard. This is going to be pretty easy. So I put that in place. It says this is going to be an SSL VPN. What is your SSL certificate? And so I've got a wildcard certificate in here, so I'm going to say let's use that. It says, where do we authenticate users? I've got an LDAP policy to say go authenticate to my domain controller. So I'm going to say use that. If I wanted to do two-factor authentication, very easy to go in and put in both factors of authentication right here. Okay. Put that in place. Does give me the ability to change my look and feel. So if I want the traditional look, if I want to go with storefront 2.x, if I want to go with storefront 3.x, I can. And then it says, what do you want to do behind this? And we'll come back to this here in a minute. But what I can do is just say, that's it. And then what it does is it goes in and does all the heavy lifting to create all the things that I need to make this work. And so I get my gateway virtual server. I get my session policies to go in here and make this work, and my profiles with the settings. And so to the end user, if they come in and connect to this gateway, it comes up. Okay? And so very easy to go in and set this up. This is set up to authenticate to Active Directory. So I've got users on the back end. Yep. And so I can just go in and say, I want to roll this out. And it says, great. How would you like to connect? And I can do, full SSL VPN, clientless access, whatever it is that I want. And then it pulls up my portal page and so on. Now, some of you guys are saying, well, what about XenApp and XenDesktop? Okay. Like I said, some of these demos take a while. So going in and configuring XenApp and XenDesktop might be a little bit of a pain. Okay. Good news is that Citrix has jumped in and decided to help me out with this and make this really easy to go in and roll out. And so what they've done is they've given me a wizard called the Unified Gateway Wizard. And so if I jump back here to my Unified Gateway Wizard, what I can do is I can go in and specify applications. Okay. Now, the applications could be the other things that I want to do remote access for. So if I've got like OWA and I want to be able to set up a portal page to that, I could do that. Or in this case, I want to do XenApp and XenDesktop. So what I do is I come in here and tell this I would like to do provide remote access to XenApp and XenDesktop. It says, are you connecting through storefront or web interface? Should be using storefront now. Okay. And it says, how do I get to your storefront? And so I go in and tell it, this is my load balanced storefront. In the newer versions, if you've got storefront 3.6 and newer, it can go in and actually detect your stores. It can't do that for me, so. I go in and tell it store-1 web. I tell it the name of my domain on the back end and what my STAs are. And so I just go through this wizard. I tell it about my storefront environment, and then it's going to go in and do all the heavy lifting for me. Okay? So it says we're set up to do ICA Proxy. Okay? If you need to see what it's done, it actually does create my policies for this. If you guys have done this before, you know it requires policies and profiles. So it has set up those policies on the back end to go in and make this work. So I've got a session profile, okay, for users coming in with a plugin versus users coming in with the web, and the policies that go with it. So look how this affects the user experience. User comes in, exact same user. Okay. They go in and authenticate, and then now they've got the option of connecting to apps and desktops. And so we come in here and say, let's do apps and desktops, and then it proxies me to storefront. Okay? And storefront is going to enumerate my apps and be able to go in and let me access them. And so what used to require a lot of manual configuration is now just been handled very easily by a wizard. Okay? Now, I didn't reboot these guys, so it'll cause a couple of fun problems there. But if my resources actually did boot up, okay, takes them a while to actually boot up. If these guys were up and available, then what would happen is I'd be able to come in and say, launch this app, and it would go in and do ICA Proxy to the gateway, and then allow me to be able to log in and launch my app on the back end here. Okay? So a little bit of an over-provisioned lab environment. It runs a little bit sluggish, but you get the general idea. Okay? Something else that is new with this. Okay? Again, now this is something we would never have demoed because this technology didn't exist before 11.0. But let's say I wanted to RDP to something. So I've got resources that I might want to come in and RDP to. Okay? What would happen is this would be a little bit tricky because we would need to go in and actually put this in place, VPN into the environment, and go in and actually set up a VPN connection, and then we can RDP to stuff on the back end. Good news. Now all we need to do is use what's called RDP Proxy. Okay? And so you can enable this in your 11.0 or newer NetScaler. You create a server profile to go in and say, this is what we're going to RDP to, which is your gateway. And so this is going to give us a clientless access RDP solution. You've got a client profile to say how the client is going to go in and connect. And then what I can do is I can tie this in with a session profile.
Muted.
And the session profile says, if this profile applies to you, here's how we use RDP Proxy. And then I've got my gateway virtual server here. And I go in and tell it to be the RDP Proxy. And so I simply come in here, set this up with my profile. And then all I need to do is go in and make this apply to somebody. And so I've got a user in here, or a group. They've got policies. And so I can go in and say, I want this guy to have the ability to do RDP Proxy. And so I go in and give him this, this policy, put this in place. And now this guy has the ability to do RDP Proxy. What is he going to RDP to? And we can go in and use a cool technology called a bookmark. And so I can simply go in and say, I want this guy to be able to RDP to the domain controller. And then what will happen is this can become a link for him. And so I can come in here, pull down this user. I give them a bookmark. And so then as a static resource, they're going to have a nice, simple link to connect to this. So take a look at this. And so what we do is we come in here, we click on this, it says, what's your username? Okay. Do I need full SSL VPN? No, that's what we're trying to get away from, is we want to do clientless RDP. So what we do is we go to the clientless access. It gives me a portal page. And then what it's going to stick on that portal page is it's going to go in and provide me a link to be able to RDP to stuff. And so for this user, they've got this link right here. And you'll see that this is going to be a link to RDP Proxy. And so it's going to download an RDP file. And so it's going to basically build this RDP file. And the RDP file says, connect to the gateway and do RDP Proxy. And so if I was to open this up, I'm going to RDP to my gateway. And then my gateway is going to proxy me to that resource on the back end. Okay? They've made some exciting enhancements to this in 12.1 as well. So instead of this needing to be completely static, we can go in and dynamically build this for different machines. And so it works a little bit cleaner, especially if you've got some power users that need to just be able to pick whatever it is they want to connect to. They can go in and do that. So this will take a minute to go in and connect, but you'll see that it's setting up a RDP connection to the gateway. And then the gateway is going to proxy it to my domain controller. Okay? So kind of a neat technology that we can go in and utilize for being able to RDP without having to set up a full SSL VPN. Okay? So a couple of neat things that they've gone in and kind of brought in terms of the newer versions of the NetScaler. Okay? So guys, that is going to conclude the lecture and the demo part of this. And so what I'll do is I'll give you guys a chance for some questions and answers. And so I'll turn it over to Rich and Hannah to field those for me.
All right, Matthew, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is we probably have to be a little careful how we answer this because we're a Citrix partner. But the question is that that many users and consultants are recommending to stay on the 11.1 firmware, and they want to know what your opinion is or your recommendation is on this.
Okay. Here's some great advice. This is going to be kind of that give a man a fish or do we teach a man to fish? And so instead of saying, yes, use 12.0 or yes, use 11.1, here's what you should do. Pull up the eDocs for any version that you're looking at going to. What you're going to see is you're going to see the known issues and the bug fixes. You're also going to be able to go in and find the marketing literature. Now, the marketing literature is probably going to be what's going to be most important. Okay. Who cares what a consultant says or anything like that? If there's something you need, that's priority number one. And so if you've got a product that's providing what we talked about today, improved SSL performance, if that's what you need, then these are the products that are going to provide it. And so nobody should be recommending sticking with an old version and not meeting your needs. And so the marketing side is going to go in and say, this is what you need. And then just be aware of the known issues. And so if you go look at 12.0 and, you know, everything that's in there has been fixed, and so it's a pretty stable version and it meets your needs, then that's probably what's right for you. Should you go to 12.1? Again, look at the eDocs. Do you need one of those things that we talked about? Do you need support for dynamic URLs for RDP? If so, that's going to be the product for you. But, and then look in the eDocs, they'll tell you the known issues. Are those things you can live with? Are those things you can adjust to? Are those things that you can wait for different fixes to come in and address? If so, maybe you do wait. If not, maybe you do jump in, you get that functionality, and it's able to meet your needs. And so if you follow that and you apply that logic to any version, NetScaler 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever comes out down the road, that is going to go in and really serve you well to be able to determine, should I adopt something or do I stay with where I'm at? And then anytime they come out with new firmware minor releases, same thing applies. Check the eDocs. They'll go in and tell you what's been fixed. They'll tell you the known issues. And then that can be a little bit more of a specific guide to a use case instead of just saying, well, everybody's doing this or everybody's doing that. Hopefully that helps.
Great answer. Thanks, Matthew. Can you elaborate a little bit on there's another question about upgrading from 11.1 to 12. And so the question is, can I do a direct upgrade, or, can I do it myself? I'm trying to read between the lines here of maybe how hard it is or how easy it is. Yeah.
Okay. Great question. Two pieces of advice here. Okay. First of all, if you do make that decision using my previous advice on where you want to go, one of the things that I would do is I would always stair step my upgrades. So if, let's just say, you're on 10.5. And what I've talked about today sounds pretty good. Should you upgrade to 12.0? And the answer is no. What you need to do is you need to go to the next version. So if you're on 10.5, go to 11.0. That way, if there's any little changes, 11.0 is going to sanitize that for you. And then you can take 11.0 to 11.1. Then you can take 11.1 to 12.0. And so that would be kind of my advice on that, is to kind of stair step, build, or version by version. That way, it's going to sanitize anything that came out of the previous version. I don't recommend taking a production NetScaler from a really old version to a new version and skipping several intermediate steps. The second piece of advice that I've got is use the command line. Okay? There is an option in the GUI. It says, would you like to use the system upgrade? It doesn't necessarily work all the time. And in fact, when it doesn't work and you call Citrix support, that's when you'll be notified that that's not a supported way of upgrading the NetScaler. So it is in the GUI. It does let you do it. For me personally, it works like 50% of the time. If you do it in the command line, you should always have success. Go in, unzip your build file, run the install in S command, and that should be able to go in and get you upgraded, usually without any incident. So hopefully that kind of helps with that process. Also, if you're doing an HA pair, you upgrade your secondary NetScaler first, let it reboot, and then you fail over to it.
All right, Matthew, thank you.